Let me start with wise words of a very well-respected law professor. He wrote, quote, "What is taught in the law schools in one generation will be widely believed by the bar in the following generation." And he might have added that it would be believed not just in the bar, but through most of the press and general public, because they get their ideas about the law from what lawyers are thinking. And I was, again and again, when I wrote my earlier books about what's wrong, what's sometimes zany or crazy about the American litigation system, I would see that if you traced it back a generation, it was the law schools where the ideas came from. Certainly, if you are discontented with the state of American tort law and liability, your beef is with a Berkeley dean named William Prosser, who completely dominated the teaching of tort law for 30 years or more. If there is something that seems off to you about the way we do sexual harassment law, you should take up your quarrel with Professor Catherine McKinnon, who more or less wrote it on the back of an envelope. If you worry about our civil procedure and how easy it makes it to sue, or our employment law and how readily it encourages people to sue their boss, again and again, it is legal academics who generated the ideas, often obscure ones not known to the general public. And I saw this big and small in famous areas and less famous. When I wrote my book on employment law, there had recently been published an article in the Harvard Law Review, a student note really, but what they call notes go on for 80 or 90 pages sometimes, and that's what this one did. And it was about the need for the law to address the allegedly dire problem, social problem, of looksism. And you can guess what looksism is. Looksism is the tendency of employers to hire the really great-looking applicant instead of the applicant who looks like me, or and this is pervasive, and economists will tell you that studies bear out that really terrific-looking people are hired more often, they are promoted faster, they earn higher amounts. So it is a problem. Whether it's a social problem that the law should take note of is another question, but this author with the Harvard Law Review was certain that it should be the next topic of discrimination law, and he proposed well, he proposed a number of possible remedies. I think my favorite remedies that he proposed were wider use of telephone interviews for jobs, and my absolute favorite, interviews behind screens. And we know this was all serious because he then went on, after leaving Harvard, to write the editorials on legal subjects for the New York Times. And he has moved on yet from there. He now teaches law at Yale. So clearly I was not the only one who took this article seriously. In the District of Columbia and quite a few other jurisdictions from coast to coast, they have passed anti-looksism ordinances which create this new ground to sue an employer. And of course they wind up with many surprising applications, people whose difference is how they do their hair, how they dress. In one case, a guy had lost his job at a retail outlet because of the metal jewelry in his tongue, which was so extensive as actually to cause a speech impediment. And as he said to the press, which was reporting on his grievance here, "This is what got me fired." So if you want to know what the headlines will be tomorrow like that, you need to go read what's in the law reviews today or a few years ago. The original working title for my book had been 10 Bad Ideas from the Law Schools and How They Changed the World. And you can imagine this didn't last to be the eventual title. For one thing, I couldn't answer the people who said, come on, Mr. Olson, only 10 bad ideas. Where are you going to stop? How long is this book going to be anyway? And I realized that rather than just having a bunch of case histories, although there are many of them in the book, I needed to concentrate a little more on why it was so predictable, why law schools kept on generating so many dreadful ideas of certain sorts. They're not randomly distributed dreadful ideas. They fall into, I think you will agree, certain patterns. And part of this is ideological. Part of it you can reduce to a kind of left-right or a libertarian statist continuum. I don't think I will surprise many people in this room when I say that our law schools today are not exactly hotbeds of libertarian thinking. Despite the best efforts of a few professors at Northwestern and formerly at Chicago, they are outnumbered at most institutions. Depending on which study you look at, it may be outnumbered 6 to 1 or 8 to 1. But if you're looking at raw things like Democrat versus Republican, one of them found a 28 to 1 imbalance at Stanford and a 23 to 1 imbalance at Columbia. I don't know which numbers are the most accurate. I do know that someone familiar with Harvard Law School reported that they went 30 years without hiring a Republican to their faculty. What I like is that during much of this period, they had a committee to fret about lack of diversity on their faculty. You know, they couldn't figure out exactly what that issue implied, apparently. And it was Elena Kagan, I believe, who broke the drought at last. One reason she had some friends on the more conservative side. Well, John McGinnis here at Northwestern has had, I guess, the funniest line about this, which is that even as it was once said of the Anglican Church in the United Kingdom that it was the Tory party at prayer, so the legal professoriate in America could be described as the Democratic Party at the lectern. And things probably have improved. You know, it certainly is more diverse than it was 10 or 15 years ago when most law schools would not probably have been able to produce a single outspoken libertarian or conservative. Now, certainly the self-respecting ones will tend to have a conservative or libertarian who's outspoken. It would be dangerous, of course, to have more than one because they might breed, but but they do often have the one, and so stop talking about them as being not diverse. Shame on you for thinking that. Well, there is a long history behind this, and I go into some of it in Schools for Misrule. You can trace it back, if you wish, a whole century to the heyday of early legal intellectuals like Roscoe Pound, who described law as, quote, applied social engineering, unquote, which suggested that perhaps the law schools should be the engineering schools to train for social engineering. It really picked up its pace during and after FDR's New Deal. And that was partly because many of the professors sympathized, and perhaps even more because many of FDR's lieutenants decided after they left the government to go off and become law professors and deans. And that brings us to the article, 1943 Yale Law Journal, which was to become the most widely cited and most influential law review article ever written on the subject of legal education, called Legal Education and Public Policy. The authors were two big New Dealers, Harold Laswell, who had been in charge of war propaganda for FDR, and Myers McDougall, a Yale professor. And they wrote at a notable juncture in history because those of you familiar with Supreme Court history will remember that it was right around that time that the Supreme Court had broken, its will had broken, in the switch in time to save nine, as it was called, to avoid court packing by FDR. They had tossed out decades of earlier jurisprudence and ruled that, after all, it was not unconstitutional for the federal government to run massive regulatory programs and intervene in the economy in other ways. And everyone sensed that we had launched on a new legal era where the courts were no longer going to stand in the way of very, very big government indeed. But, said Laswell and McDougall, here were the law schools, and they hadn't changed at all. They were continuing, as they had done for decade after decade, to devote their curriculum to training people to go out and practice law on Main Street, to become the sorts of lawyers who arranged business deals, resolved disputes, advised affluent clients how to keep their money out of the government's hands. This was not what we were going to need from the lawyers of the future, they argued. Law schools, they argued, should determine their curriculum, quote, in reference to social objectives. You know when it's that vague that you're in trouble. And getting more specific, they said that the private law courses should de-emphasize such bastions of the old law as contract and property, which they sniffed at as, quote, much favored instruments of the laissez-faire society. If you had to have a course in property law, they said, why not take the development of public housing projects or land use planning as the jumping off point to learn about property? Well, they were equally discontented when you got to so-called public law, and they said that, and I'm quoting here, the so-called public law courses are still organized with too much deference to separation of powers, jurisdiction, due process, equal protection, interstate commerce, and these are their air quotes, not mine, etc. Trusts and estates, well, we should recognize that private inheritance would not play a very big role in the new society. Local government law, another waste of time. They said that new lawyers should be trained how to develop regional government mechanisms like the Tennessee Valley Authority, and on and on and on. Well, this is wrong on so many different levels, and there is so much that we could say to criticize it, but let me start by saying that it was really, really terrible as prediction of where the jobs would be in the legal profession. If you trained on how to plan out public housing projects, your skills might have been in demand for another 10, 15 years, but eventually would go really out as society realized just how much of a wrong path that was. Likewise with developing new versions of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and on and on. Parenthetically, you constantly hear from people in law schools about what the next area will be to boom in law, where lawyers should be trained in that, and which will be the ones that bust. Never pay any attention to this because they're always wrong. For example, it was said in the 1970s that energy law was the big new area that everyone had to be trained in, and of course it did not boom. Instead, you got a boom in trademark licensing law, which no one had predicted, so no one was trained how to handle it. And many other bad predictions. In the future, most people would use group legal services. No, they don't. And divorce would decline in salience because of no fault. No, it didn't. And on and on. So they don't have a very good track record in predicting where the law is necessarily headed. And yet, this article was so influential. The only thing missing was the phrase dustbin of history. The sense had really set in that teaching law as it was kind of passé and not very glamorous, and could be de-emphasized, and teaching law as it should be was a much more suitable thing for law schools to be doing. Yes, some people might complain about indoctrination, but after all, weren't we indoctrinating students when we taught the old way of doing things? It's really a matter of having the courage of your convictions to explain where the current law needs to be changed. So they argued, at least. And the program was so impractical, for reasons that we'll get to in a moment, that it was not adopted as a whole anywhere, not even Yale. And yet, about 10 years later, Yale Law School, then as now the most prestigious law school, did something kind of remarkable that at least got the attention of everyone in legal education, which is that they dropped property as a required course. And this was considered almost unheard of because property figured very prominently on the bar exam that you had to study for. Property law was something that all sorts of different lawyers with all sorts of different practices had to know about and was going to come up, whether you practiced family or business or inheritance or many other types of law. You would have to know about property. And yet, so clever were Yale students that they could study for the bar exam in their spare time, and dropping things like property as a required course would free up all sorts of their time for more interesting things like philosophical discussions about how the government should be organized. And this tied in with, I'm not going to go through the Yale Anthem, which is to the tune, the Yale Law School Anthem is to the tune of don't know much about history. And it begins to don't know much about property, don't know much about bankruptcy. I won't sing the whole thing, you wouldn't like it if I did, but suffice it to say that Yale professors had a public image as really adorably clueless if you had an actual legal problem that you needed solved. If you needed to bail someone out of jail or someone had reneged on your contract. And it was as if the professors at the most admired medical schools were the ones who were most at a loss when you give them an actual sick patient to treat. Malcolm Gladwell was in the New Yorker last month with an article on academic rankings and how strange and artificial they are in general. And certainly this is true of the legal rankings, US News, which, along with the accreditation process, tend to reward schools for being more Yale-like. The more you have a heavily published faculty with all sorts of interdisciplinary PhD this and unreadable theoretical that, the more you are likely to be Yale-like. And to me, this is like a rating system which looked at the entertainment world, noticed that the #1 commercial act was Lady Gaga, and recommended that all other entertainers should become more Lady Gaga-like. So you had this tension which has persisted between getting an education that allows you to actually go out and practice law and getting an education that will be the most prestigious and highly ranked. Well, back at Yale, they had freed up all this time, and sure enough, all sorts of ideas began pouring out of Yale from this period. Charles Reich, famous to the general public for writing The Greening of America, is much more famous to lawyers for writing the New Property, which argued that even as we de-emphasized things like real estate and chattels as topics of legal study, we should recognize that the right to go on holding a government job or the right to go on getting a welfare check should be recognized as the new property, just as hard to take away from someone as the old property. Tremendously influential idea that has been credited with kicking off much of the rights revolution of the 60s and 70s. And law schools were gripped by fad after fad. There was the fad for constitutional law, which held that pretty much the editorial page agenda of the New York Times was actually, if you peered at the US Constitution closely enough, you would realize that it required higher welfare payments and national health insurance and so forth. And this had its day for some years. There was identity politics, and I trace out the consequences there for things like the slavery reparations movement. And most recently, there has been the vogue of interest in international human rights. Many of you may still imagine from your early familiarity with this subject that international human rights mostly means getting dissidents out of dungeons and making sure that bad regimes do not close down opposition newspapers and ban opposition parties. I'm afraid that that's out of date. If you think that's what international human rights is mostly about, go to the major websites of the 20 or more law schools that now have active projects in this area, or to Amnesty International or to Human Rights Watch, and you will find that although here and there are still discussions of politically oppressed opposition figures or minorities, there will be all sorts of articles about the need for more stringent domestic violence rules, said to be too lax in Sweden, according to one of the projects, the right to health care as an international human right, the right to minimum income, labor rights. I wish I had $1 for every time I've read in the last month from a legal academic that the policies of Governor Walker in Wisconsin are not just unwise, but are violations of international human rights for which he should be held to account. This is a really widespread position out there. And another very popular one. And there's a familiar pattern in some of this, which is that you wind up discovering that just as an earlier generation of law professors believed that their entire policy agenda could be read into the US Constitution, so we are quickly approaching the day when the entire policy agenda will be read into international human rights. And some of you may have noticed the coverage early this year when a UN body flayed the United States as an international human rights violator, and it had this long, long bill of particulars, 30 different things. And the Obama administration's response was to say, oh, it's so unfair for them to say that the United States is violating the international human rights of its citizens by not having government health care. Look at the strides we took just last year when we passed Obamacare. That was a major step toward bringing ourselves into compliance with world norms. And that, to me, I guess that was the kind of reassurance that actually left me less reassured than when it started out. If I'd known that it was going to be that, that was going to be a reason to pass Obamacare, I think I would have fought it harder in the first place. So let me try to wrap up here. The ideas from law schools give government more to do. I guess in that respect they are kind of recognizably ideas of the left. But it's not just that they give government more to do. They give lawyers and judges more to do. They give legal intellectuals more to do. And I think Friedrich Hayek would have recognized exactly what was going on here when he wrote about the tendency of intellectuals in every area to be attracted to ideologies that make them more influential themselves. It didn't particularly work out for many of the other disciplines in the modern university, but oh, how it has worked out for the law professors. This is good news for them. It is good news for many of their graduates. I'm not sure that it's such great news for all the rest of us. Thanks. I understand that we have some time for questions and answers before we break. Yes, ma'am.
Kathy Posner, not related to Judge Posner, but
okay.
He was mentioned in the book, so every time I see Posner, I get excited. I just pretend that I'm a lawyer. Love the book, Ready to Ready.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone who hasn't bought should buy. One of the things that I was thinking about when I read it, and everything is so democratic at law schools, but maybe it's that those who can do, those who can't teach, and we're not getting Republican professors, not only because they might not be accepted, but because they can get real jobs in the real world where they have to do something and produce something instead of only teaching 2 classes a week. So do you think it's that the Republicans aren't just as interested in becoming professors?
You've opened up a big question here. It's the question of to what extent the underrepresentation of right-of-center views is due to, it's been called self-selection. That is, the terms of very high-paying legal practice at big firms are more appealing to some people than others. You get a different and to many people preferable, I would myself much prefer the lifestyle, even accepting less money for it, that the law professors get. And might that be distinguishing between some Republicans who are more up for that, the pressures of big firm practice? I have no doubt that that's part of the answer. I think there is more to the answer than that, and I try to pick the different reasons apart. There is a clubbiness. You get admitted to the club by being acceptable to the people currently in the club, if this is a matter of being hired under law faculties. And it isn't necessarily conscious discrimination. It's a matter of comfort levels. Oh, you're working in an area that I already follow. Your mentor was a professor that I already know. This is not a conscious ideological bias, and yet it can make the libertarian applicant seem Martian. George Mason, oh yeah, isn't that a nest of libertarians out there? And I guess Alan Dershowitz, who I so often criticize, had a very good line when he said that everyone considers diversity to consist of hiring more of themselves.
You're appearing next week at Improv, by the way, what next? Yeah.
There's a question, yes.
Recently, the Dean of the Law School spoke to the Council on Global Affairs here, and the emphasis was on we need to adapt to a global legal system, not a U.S. legal system. And I guess what is your view on that?
I think that, I'm sorry, which law school was it, the Dean of?
Harvard.
Oh, Harvard, okay. It seems to me that international law is much oversold to students who should realize at this point that with the new governance structure not in place yet and probably to be resisted by the current U.S. Congress, the jobs in international law are mostly jobs in things like international trade. Someone had a good blog post about this recently saying to the first-year law student, do you fluently speak at least one language of a major trading partner? If not, probably don't think about international law because most of the jobs are still in facilitating trade. Now, it is certainly much on the mind of many professors that down the road we will have every capital punishment controversy appealed not just to the US Supreme Court but to The Hague or Geneva. Maybe at that point there will be more room for criminal lawyers who know international law. Maybe healthcare denial will be appealable to the Organization of American States, but it hasn't happened yet. And if enough people have me come around and speak, it may not happen at all. I would say, the schools fall in love with international law. There is, as I explained, a huge amount of foundation money from Ford and Soros and various others being plowed into the international programs, hoping to get a more globally oriented legal profession. 90, whatever it is, asymptotically close to 99% of the legal work out there, you will do just as well if you hadn't taken any of those courses. Yes?
Would Ave Maria, for example, be an exception to what you've been describing?
Yeah. Ave Maria, for those of you who don't follow it, is a Michigan and Florida-based law school organized to provide specifically a strong alternative to the prevailing way of thinking, and with Catholic flavor as well. Yes, it would, and increasingly, as people have seen the gap to be filled, there have been, I mentioned George Mason in the DC suburbs, which made a point of going out and hiring some extremely good scholars who were not getting the sorts of offers that they really deserved from their scholarship. There are signs that something similar may be going on at Pepperdine, where Ken Starr was the dean. So it does provide a market opportunity, and one of the interesting things here is that some of the people associated with some of these law schools are not even particularly right of center. It's just they notice an underserved area where you can pick up really talented professionals to teach, and some parents and students will greatly value the product of the legal education that it provides. I know that, yes, in back. Oh, in the corner there.
The pendulum swings on all types of social issues constantly. And how far do you think this tendency that you're highlighting will continue to go? Because it seems like the economic consequences of many of these policies now are starting to take center stage, given the obligations of the debt that's been incurred related to them.
I'm more optimistic in the book than readers may expect. I think that many of the things that I criticize hit their peak, maybe 15 years ago, and have gradually been getting better. In particular, I mentioned that the extreme imbalance then is now only a pronounced imbalance ideologically, that the extreme impracticality and the rule of the theory heads, as they were called, peaked after it was eventually dawned on them that no one in the world of real legal practice was paying the least bit attention anymore to what the theoreticians were saying. So you have more engagement in real world legal issues. You have the whole success of the law and economics movement, which, although ideologically quite varied in flavor, nonetheless teaches that there are costs and benefits to everything, and that you need to take measurement of consequences seriously. This is something that can only be an improvement on some of the earlier ways of approaching law. Now, just as I thought that I had built a case for some optimism, when I spoke the other week at my own Cato Institute, the commentary was by Judge Doug Ginsburg of the D.C. Circuit, a former Supreme Court nominee. And although he mostly agreed with what I said, he said that I underestimated just how awful the trends currently were, because new schools had emerged. He was particularly hard on the behavioral law and economics variant that has sprung off of law and economics, and he said that the mischief being done by these newly formed schools would last basically long enough for me to never catch up with it. That was discouraging to hear, not, I guess, all that surprising, but it made me realize that one never does really defeat the different errors, one just encounters them in new forms. Yes?
Do you have any prescriptions for how to change the culture of the legal profession through the law schools?
I wish I had magical prescriptions. I think that for a very long time, those of us probably the viewpoint well represented in this room and at our institutes have tended to ignore the law schools, or if we paid any attention, just rooted for a few friends we knew were there, like Richard Epstein, the law and economics movement. And yet this is not how the other point of view has approached it. The Federalist Society is great in what it does. I'm always boosting the Federalist Society, but it can't really hold much of a candle to the hundreds of millions of dollars of philanthropy from Ford, MacArthur, and various other foundations, which have focused. Ford identified a very long time ago, certainly by the 50s, maybe even by the 1940s, the extraordinary leverage that philanthropy to law schools would afford them in changing the atmosphere of the legal profession and through it, the atmosphere in the law. The record of, one of the sub-stories that my book tells is the extraordinary success, occasionally mingled with failures, but mostly remarkable successes that Ford had in doing things like creating the clinical law movement, where every law school is now expected to have a bunch of clinics where students go out and sue people, often somewhat ideologically charged clinics. The growth of identity politics is an area in law schools tremendously fueled by philanthropy from the Ford Foundation in particular. The things that MacArthur has done with, I believe it's MacArthur that supported Bernardine Dohrn's project at Northwestern, of which I'm quite critical in my book. And so look for where the mirror image philanthropy from a libertarian or freedom-minded standpoint is. And it's hard to find much more than law and economics and the Federalist Society. Do we have time for any more questions, Nikki? Two more? Okay. There was one at this table, or is...
Well,
okay, yes,
I ask
sir.
it anyway, and that is, people like me who are not lawyers but are interested in liberty are always seeming to be on the defensive anything we do. And I'm wondering, to follow up on Jim's question, to follow up a little bit, is without putting too fine a point on it, are there any law schools that are offensive?
Offensive?
Offensive in the sense of working to actively promote liberty.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I guess I will give yet a third plug to George Mason, which is of all things a state school as part of the Virginia State University system, and as such you might see as potentially vulnerable to politicians in the future, but because they are in the DC area, because they've hired some of the brightest libertarian scholars, as well as, they do not try to provide a lopsided classroom experience, and they have some extremely good scholars on the left as well. But the work that they are doing indicates that there is a lot of ferment and interest to be had by bringing together good minds who all have a particular way of approaching a problem. That having been said, part of what makes it so difficult to reform this area is that everyone, and I'm afraid I include myself in this, tends to join in the advice to future law students: go to the highest ranked place that takes you, even if it's more expensive, even if it's at the wrong end of the country, because that's so terribly important to your future chances of who's going to come around to recruit at those schools and so forth. Now, I feel as if I ought to reproach myself, and yet yesterday someone was asking, should I drop 30 points in the rankings in order to go to a more ideologically satisfying law school? And I had to say no. Not if you are mostly concerned about the career you'll have.
Quick follow-up to that. It seems to me that as a non-lawyer who distressingly runs into lawyers.
That's the context in which most people run into lawyers, is distressingly.
I would prefer to deal with those who, and would pay a premium for those who think like I do, because they will better represent me.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to the extent that that kind of pressure begins to be felt from sources of jobs, And I think you may see it around the edges in areas like military law, for example, where I think it's believed within the Judge Advocate General Corps that there are campuses that where the students will get a reasonably sympathetic view of military law as part of an education, and other ones where they won't. It wouldn't surprise me if there was more of a hiring pipeline. Indeed, I've heard with respect to particular schools that there was a good hiring pipeline to schools that were not on principle anti-military. Likewise, possibly with some aspects of prosecution or criminal defense, although there I don't think you'll find as much of a difference among law schools. When it comes to economic liberty, I guess it remains to be seen. I have not heard of many people hiring for law firms that care that much about that. And indeed, I could tell stories from Washington, D.C. about just how many institutions that are supposed to have a mission will then not make sharing that mission fortunately, it's not true of our think tanks, but you go out to a senator's office who may supposedly be have been elected as a strong conservative, and you find that they'd rather take the person from with slightly better credentials and an obviously unsympathetic ideological record. Yes?
A quick one. Tenure in all areas tends to be a problem, and it would seem to me that that's a major barrier or obstacle in terms of any change.
Yeah. Tenure is flaring up as an issue now because suddenly there are proposals to not to abolish tenure, not to switch from one rule to the opposite rule, but simply to say that you can be in an accredited law school without having a certain rigid set of tenure rules. And of course, it's as if a nuclear bomb went off in the faculty lounges. I am not so consistently anti-tenure that I would recommend that there ought to be a crusade to abolish it, but I do think that it sounds like a very promising step to pull the accreditors out of it so that we can see how the market works. You may wind up with an equilibrium where a bunch of institutions retain strong tenure and a bunch of other ones don't. I'd like to see how that develops. And I think it would be better for student options and also probably better for people trying to break into law teaching than if you have tenure everywhere.